let you visit with him personally, and he is right here, Mr. Al Bromberg.
I fully expect you to want to have a picture with me. Anyway, folks, I'm so pleased to be here. I really appreciate this opportunity. My story is a little different. My family were actually survivors of the death camps. They were actually in the death camps. If the war had lasted 2 weeks longer, if the American troops had not liberated them, I wouldn't be here, because they would not have lived. Now, so, the Holocaust, what does that mean? It means a great fire. It means being consumed by fire until it's completely gone. It's a sacrifice. In Hebrew, that would be Shoah, which means great calamity. In German, it would be Endlosung, which means, or Vernichtung, which means destruction or extermination. And that was kind of the idea that the Germans had. The Germans had for their Jewish population. I want you to know something. World War II was a calamity for everybody. 50 million people of all nationalities, of all religions, were murdered, including 8 million Germans. So how did they improve their lot in life? How did they make themselves better off by bringing that kind of calamity on Europe? It actually put Europe back 50 years. It took that long for them to recoup, to rebuild, to repopulate. Now, regrettably, a large segment of that were my people. You know, a few things fly all over me. When I hear somebody say 6 million, you know, that's so abstract. When I say 6 million, you know, it's not really possible to wrap your arms around that. It's not possible to say, well, I understand that, because I don't understand it. But if you reduce it to the ridiculous, how many of you have ever been to War Memorial Stadium? Okay. War Memorial Stadium holds a little over 50,000 people. And whenever the Razorbacks used to play, back when they used to be good, it was always full. But the thing that I want you to know is the 6 million represent filling War Memorial Stadium 120 times. That's how many Jewish people they destroyed. But the second thing that bothers me is that 6 million doesn't even come close. I mean, that's a figure that they agreed on. In my travels, in my studies, in my search for the truth, there were at least 2 million that were not accounted for, because when the Nazis invaded Russia, they indiscriminately shot people wherever they found them, and they didn't record it in every instance. So, you know, I'll accept the 6 million because that's a figure that has been settled on by historians, and it's not correct. But the thing that bothers me the most is when I hear somebody, a survivor or a child of a survivor or a historian say, I speak for 6 million people who can't, because you can't do that. I can't do that. But I can tell you this. I can speak very well for the 200 plus members of my family who were indiscriminately murdered simply because of their religion. To me, that's the greatest disaster that I can imagine. Imagine this. I grew up not knowing what they looked like. No pictures left, because we were not supposed to even survive. There was no reason to have pictures. They destroyed those too. I want to apologize. I broke a tooth and I have a device in here that's new and I'm having difficulty speaking, so if I sound kind of strange, that's what it is. But I want you to know that every single life cycle event that I had, I was bar mitzvahed, I had a consecration, a confirmation, I graduated from high school, college, graduate school. I actually had the opportunity to be married to a wonderful woman. And at every one of those life cycle events, I had no family there to share it with me. Because some lunatic and some country decided that they were going to destroy my family for whatever reason. Now I'm going to tell you that the mindset of the Nazis was insane. They had 44,000 camps, concentration camps, they had transit camps, they had work camps, they had camps where they housed the insane, that they drove insane, death camps, bordellos, every kind of imaginable thing to degrade the people they had. Now, in order to do that, they dedicated almost 1 million people that they could have had in their army to murder people. How many of you here hate somebody? Now, raise your hands. I know they're, all right. Could that hatred for that person inspire you to hate everybody like them? Raise your hands. My man, I appreciate you. Anyway, I want you to know that that's exactly what they did. That's exactly what they did. And they had a lot of allies. I mean, they recruited over 1 million Lithuanians, Latvians, Ukrainians to aid them in their debauchery. My family lived in Poland for 600 years. How did we end up there? Well, you know, everybody says that the Holocaust started in 1933 when Hitler came to power. Baloney! The Holocaust started with the diaspora when the Jews were cast out of the Holy Land by the Romans and dispersed to all four corners of the earth. Okay, that was really the spiritual beginning of the Holocaust. These people went to all these foreign countries, they dressed differently, they acted differently, they had different customs, they ate differently, they had laws of what and how to eat. And you have to remember that at that time, Europe was very primitive. I mean, you had 5% nobles and 95% peasants. So, naturally, they were, to say the least, curious about these new people, to the point that they just didn't even want them to be there. I can almost understand that. I can almost understand it. But there were bloodlettings. There were laws that were incredibly prohibited, like Jews' tax, like not allowing them to live in certain areas, like every Easter, a priest would stir the people up and talk about Jews being Christ killers and using the blood of Christian children to make matzah. You know, a lot of terrible things, but all that paled in comparison to the two events that really led to a huge shift in Jewish habitation. The first one were the Crusades. Anybody know what the Crusades were? Yes, sir. Yes, sir. The Crusades were supposedly the European kings were going to go up to the Holy Land and take Jerusalem back from the infidel. They absolutely felt like it should be in Christian hands. But on their way, they decided they were going to kill the infidel that were among them. That was the Jews. And there was a huge bloodletting. there was a huge amount of murder. And it got to the point that in the 13th century, the Second Crusade, they absolutely killed the entire population of Worms, Germany, Mainz, Koblenz, Speyer, and several other communities. So there was no future in Franco Germany at that time for Jews. So basically, about that time, Kazimierz the Great, who was the new Polish king, decided he wanted to modernize his country. He needed to have a middle class. So he invited the Jews to come there because they knew crafts, they knew how to make things, they knew how to administer medicine, they knew music, they knew science, they knew art, and he brought them in and immediately brought his country into the current century. So he was wonderful. He was. They flourished. They did well. But the Jews' story in Poland is directly related to whoever was the king at that time. It would go up and it would go down for centuries. There were times where Jews weren't allowed to live in central Poland. But after about 200 years, they were. And my family went from the Bugiac area to central Poland. They populated 3 villages in central Poland: Kaluszyn, Minsk Mazowiecki, and Stanisławo Mazowiecki. Don't try to repeat that. But I will tell you that it was kind of provincial, you know. I mean, all 3 of these villages, my relatives lived in. I had a huge family. But I want to tell you a little bit about, and we'll get into that here in just a moment, but the insanity of the Nazis is that they didn't even use the Jews for the things that they could have really benefited from. They didn't use Jewish scientists, some of whom developed our atomic program. They didn't use Jewish doctors. They excoriated Jewish artists and professionals, and all that could have helped them. I mean, honestly, we might be, or you all might be speaking German if they would have used them. I wouldn't be here. But I will tell you this. Thank God they didn't. And thank God for the United States of America. I want to interject here. This has nothing to do with my Holocaust presentation, but you are so fortunate to be Americans. You have no idea what a wonderful gift you've been given, because you have the opportunity to be anything you want. And you have the opportunity to go as high as you want or as low as you want. You don't have to do anything. But the one thing that you can do is exceed your expectations, and you can also do anything within your imagination. And you really, I have a lot of faith in this generation. I think that you're going to bring back the greatness that America was, that make us into the light, the beacon that we've always been. And don't ever let anybody tell you that we're not, because without America, there's no world. And you're hearing that from somebody who was fortunate enough to be allowed to come here and who benefited, who grabbed the American dream and wrote it for everything that it was worth. So, getting back to what we're talking about. My mother's story, my mother was born in a city called Łódź, Poland. Łódź was the second largest city in Poland, but more important than anything, it was the center of industrial effort. I mean, they had a complex of factories and different avenues of revenue that were just incredible. Now, Łódź was 4 hours by car from Berlin. They were very attuned to German society. It's a fact, there were an inordinate number of ethnic Germans living in Łódź. And they actually contributed to the fall of Poland. They identified military locations, arms caches, fortifications, various different things that helped the German army in their invasion of Poland. My grandfather, on my mother's side, was a pretty wealthy, articulate, and urbane man who owned a very popular nightclub in Berlin. He had family in Lodz. He traveled there for a visit, and my grandmother, on my mother's side, was a beautiful woman. Strikingly beautiful. He saw her and fell completely in love. He wanted to marry her at that moment and take her back to Berlin. And she said, "You're dreaming. I'm not going to Berlin." And so he went back to Berlin, sold his nightclub, and moved back to Lodz to marry my grandmother. Well, as happens a lot of times, he came back and had what he felt like was a catharsis. He saw all the poor people, the poverty, and he became a progressive. Went from being a Lothario to a progressive, and from a progressive to a communist, because he felt that was the best way to help the poor people. He was an idealist. All of a sudden, he was an idealist. So, my mother was born in 1924. She was a precocious child. She was a tomboy. She was very active, difficult to control. And she had the misfortune to have two parents that were really pretty self-absorbed. So it was difficult for her. She was a wonderful, loving woman, but she had a tough time. They were a small family. They had a boy about 5 years later, and at that time, the Polish government was actively purging communists from their country. So my grandfather, for whatever reason, had to go into hiding. The Polish authorities came to their flat, smacked my grandmother around to find out where he was at, and she didn't know. And she told us she didn't know. They grabbed the baby from her arms, threw it on the ground, and killed the baby. This is before the Holocaust. They then left and said, "We'll be back." Well, anyway, my mother suffered from that for the rest of her life. My grandmother had a complete nervous breakdown, so she had to go into the hospital. My grandfather, who was a man, in my estimation, of no account, was not able to care for her because he couldn't come out of hiding. And her grandmother was too old and too feeble to take care of such a precocious child. So she was put into a orphanage for 2 years, run by none other than Chaim Grumkowski, who the Germans installed as the titular head of the Lodz ghetto. She went through a very difficult time in the orphanage. Her parents came back around finally after 3 years, and without explaining anything, they had rehabilitated themselves and collected her, took her home. That was her years before going into the Lodz ghetto. The Lodz ghetto was one of the largest, most brutal reservations for human cattle ever. They were treated with incredible cruelty. I mean, there was a three-pronged effort. One is, let's starve them, let's work them to death, let's degrade them beyond belief. And that was really one of the main things that the Germans wanted to do. They wanted to degrade these people so that they could never, ever be normal again. Um, this ghetto had no running water, had no electricity, had no sewage. I mean, think of where you live now, and think if you had to be thrown into something like that. And that's exactly what happened. I mean, these people were all relatively intelligent, advanced, and you know, lived normal lives with normal facilities. All of a sudden, they had none of that. The worst part about it is that the guy they chose to run it, the Germans always tried to make it seem like the Jews were doing this to themselves. So they appointed a committee, supposedly of the most prominent citizens in that area, to become the governing body. And they used this Chaim Lenkowski as a foil. In October of 1942, he had the temerity to get up in front of the entire ghetto and say to the inhabitants, "Give me your children!" The Germans decided they were going to send 20,000 children to the gas chamber because they were useless eaters. There was no real reason for them to live. They couldn't work. They contributed nothing other than to their own families. And there was no future because there weren't going to be any Jews. So, of course, there was a big outcry. Somebody said to me, "I'm going to take your children." They'd have to kill me to take my children. That's how I feel. But these people were beaten down. They were absolutely, completely demoralized. And it happened. They took their children. Now, my grandfather died in the ghetto. He came down with typhus and died. And I don't know when, and I don't really care. But my grandmother really became a pretty good human being. Remember, these people were forced to live in one room, several families. There was a baby on the floor above them whose young mother, died. And the baby was alive. The baby cried and wailed. And because human life had become so cheap, because it didn't matter, the baby was ignored. People cared about themselves. People were not going to take on responsibility for anything that didn't relate to their own well-being or comfort. So that baby cried. My grandmother, who had lost a child, I think saw a chance for redemption. She went upstairs, took the baby, nurtured it, kept it alive, and actually came to believe that she was the child's mother. So when he called for the 20,000 to be transported to Helmno for gassing, the baby was going to be one of them. And my grandmother, to her everlasting credit, went with the baby. She sacrificed her life so that child would not go to the gas chamber by itself. And to me, that was the ultimate act of humanity. So, my mother, who was an orphan, continued to exist there. Nobody interacted or offered her any kind of help. She was all alone. She was a young teenager, like many of you, and she managed to survive because she had an indomitable spirit. Because the things that you've heard about Jews walking into a gas chamber without protest are BS. Because there were many small rebellions and large ones too. Because in her heart, she wasn't going to allow them to determine when she was going to, or how she was going to die. So she managed to survive in the Lodz ghetto until July of 1945, at which time she was transferred to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Auschwitz was the largest death camp in the system. She managed to pass through the selection. A man named Joseph Mengele, who was a doctor, supposedly a doctor, deciding who would live and who would die. Go to the left, go to the right. She managed to survive because she looked well enough to be able to work. So in January of 45, the survivors were taken on a death march, and they had to march 30 miles to Gliwice, where they were loaded onto open gondola cars on a train in the middle of a brutal winter and transported through the Carpathian Mountains to Austria. Half of the people died on the trip from exposure. She was fortunate. She was in the center of the car, so she actually got some protection from the wind and from the cold. More about that later. My father's family is different. My mother was a city Jew. They were more assimilated. They were, very much Polish in their thoughts. My father was from a country environment, and he had a huge family. I mean, he was the 10th of 13 children, and my grandfather was very prolific. The family really grew, and of course, all the families were pretty decent size. That's why we had over 200 members. But they were very close. They were very loving. They really didn't accept the abuse that a lot of the city Jews did because they were tougher and because they had finally decided, hey, look, I don't have to listen to this anymore. And my father and his younger brother, who was a psycho, basically, and some of their cousins, taught the Poles a lesson. And finally, when they realized that they weren't going to be able to intimidate them or make them feel like they were inferior, they became pals, I mean, we had to all live together. In a small environment, you do business together, everything's together. You have market together, and you even live close to each other. So that had to work out, and that was all over Poland. My grandfather's father, my great-grandfather, actually started a enterprise in Stanislav that was like a shoe factory. And that grew and grew and grew, and with all the kids working, and then the additional revenue they got, they actually built it into a pretty sizable business. It actually was the largest employer in Mazowiecki County. Everything was really going well, and then my grandfather died in 1935, and the strongest person in the family to take charge was an aunt, an older aunt. And the only problem was that she was mentally ill. She had, she was today what they call bipolar, a problem, and also schizophrenia. Most of them thought she was mean, evil, whatever, but she really did have a bad problem. She immediately reduced everybody in the family to slave status. Without discussing it with them, she sold my father and his immediate younger brother into serfdom in Warsaw to a shoemaker. And they had to, she was paid by them, by him, and they had to work it off. She insulted their customers, and as a result, they ended up losing a lot of revenue. Setting up exactly what happened next. When the Germans invaded on September 1, 1939, the Jews of Poland knew what to expect. It wasn't any surprise. They knew what had been going on in Germany and Austria and Czechoslovakia. They knew that they were in for a real terrible time. They didn't know to the extent, but they knew that it wasn't going to be a walk in the park. So my father and uncle left Warsaw and walked to Stanislav, which is 24 kilometers away. They had to go through the forest and the countryside because on the roads, if you were caught by either side, by the Poles, they would shoot you because they would claim you were a deserter. If you got caught by the Germans, they'd make you drop your pants and see that you were circumcised, and they would kill you. So you were going to get killed one way or the other. So they finally got to Stanislav. They went to try to help my grandmother, and they had a young brother who was born, you know, on the cusp of things, and he was still, you know, very young, and their youngest sister who had a baby. Well, they got there, and my grandmother refused to go. They were going to go to the Bug River to try to cross over into to Russia, because Russia had jumped Poland from the other side, and they had actually they were going to administer half of it, and the demarcation line was the Bug River. They begged her to go, and she said, no, even the Germans won't hurt women and small children. Famous last words. But anyway, she refused, but she insisted that they go. And so they begged her to allow them to take Noah, who was just, you know, like a 10-year-old child at that time. She refused. So they went. My grandmother, and I'll tell you about that in a moment here, but they actually got to the Bug River, and by that point, it was closed off. They weren't allowing, or they were doing everything they could to keep Jews from crossing over. And if they did make it across, the Russians would apprehend them. So they were kind of a dilemma. They actually started to figure out a way to subsist until they could cross over. My father was fortunate enough to get a job with a shoemaker so that they could eat. They lived out in the fields. They, you know, had no place to live, and constantly they were trying to find a way to cross over into the Russian side. Well, one day while my father was working, my uncle did manage to get across with a friend. And that was okay with my dad because that was the purpose. They were going to get away. My uncle did get over. He actually survived. His story is incredible. I just don't have the time to tell you about it. But he ended up being an officer in the Russian army. And he liberated that part of Poland where my family was from. So my dad, free from having to worry about taking care of his little brother, then tried to figure out his own escape. And in the interim, he was captured by the Gestapo. That was the German secret police. They put him into a stockade, which was basically a barbed wire enclosure, along with all the other Jewish young men, they call it. And they had them do menial tasks like digging latrines, building roads, building landing fields for their aircraft, and anything else they could figure out. So, and they fed them next to nothing, and the only clothing they had was what they had on when they were captured. Finally, when the Germans attacked Russia on June 21st, 1941, they kind of bit off more than they could chew. Initially, they were, you know, it was like a hot knife through butter. I mean, they just went through Russia like, you know what, through a Christmas turkey, but they absolutely were brutal, and they killed people every step of the way. However, when the autumn rains came, the roads turned to mud, and their attack became bogged down. So they brought all these Jewish men into Belarus and used them to push the tanks and the trucks and the artillery out of the mud quagmire. And, you know, again, I told you the 44,000 camps. Well, this wasn't a camp. They had thousands of these, you know, just groups of men that they called a commando that were used for a specific task. You know what they did when the task was over? They killed them. You know, why bother to you know, you're going to kill these people anyway. Why bother to transfer them somewhere else? There are plenty more to take their place. My dad was very lucky because they found out that he knew shoe repair, and that's something they really needed. So he didn't get killed. He got put into a hellhole called Blizny, which was a work camp directed by a complete sadist who was crazy, and he tried to develop new ways to kill multiple people with one bullet. They did have barracks there. My dad was in a barrack with a huge, demented Ukrainian who was their capo. Capo was barrack chief. This guy was a criminal, and he was in there because he was a criminal. But he had an unholy hatred for Jews. He decided he was going to beat this young Jewish boy to death. And my father interceded, and I know about this because one of the survivors told me about it. Because my dad never told me anything. But he screamed to the man, "Leave him alone, Eager." That man's name was Eager. And he just laughed at him. So he took his wooden shoe off. They had to wear wooden shoes. And cracked the guy's skull open. So naturally, the Germans were not happy that he had done this to their puppet. But he was whipped. They didn't kill him because they really needed a shoe man. And in addition to that, I think they really wanted to see how much he could take. Because he didn't back down. He never backed down from them. You weren't supposed to look them in the eye. He never looked down. And I think that they just really had to find out what he was made of. So anyway, finally, he was transferred to a place called Krasny Dvor, which means red door in Russian. And there, he was assigned to refurbish German boots that were sent there from the Eastern Front. He was thrilled because in the boots he found pieces of toes and feet and that kind of thing, which made them realize, hey, the Germans are losing. You know, the Germans are not invincible like they want you to believe. So that was a great thing. They were starving. They were starving. They were giving them maybe 800 calories a day. At the beginning of the war, he weighed 183 pounds. When he was liberated, he weighed 82 pounds. So you can imagine what that kind of... He even said to me one time, he said, "You don't know what hunger can do. Men will do things they never imagined they would do." And it was something that I didn't understand because I was always well fed. You can't understand what they went through because it's inconceivable. Even beasts don't do these kind of things to their own kind. He, at one point in Krasny Dvor, saw some potato peels at the edge of a cesspool. And he was so hungry, he went over and gathered them up and ate them. And I say to you, how is that allowed? So anyway, he was in 9 different camps. He went from Krasny Dvor to Majdanek, which was a death camp. He managed to survive again because he could make shoes. He went from Majdanek to a sub-camp of Auschwitz. and from there to Plaszow. Now, I don't know if any of you ever saw Schindler's List, but that was about Plaszow concentration camp. You all are probably too young to know about that, but I wish you'd see it because it really was a really good visual of what life was like. From there, and they realized that the Russians were going to overcome them, but they were not going to allow the Jews to live. So he was loaded onto a cattle car with 2,000 other people, and they were transported in the dead of summer. And Polish summers are brutal. He was transported to Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria. It was about a 7-day trip. And they couldn't travel during the day because the Allies were bombing the railways. In addition to that, the Germans needed to have the railways cleared to transport their troops. So during the day, they would be put in the siding with the sun beating down on these cars without water, without air. Basically, people were going to the bathroom where they were standing because there was nothing to go to the bathroom in. So the air was stifling. And when they actually finally got to Mauthausen, a third of them were still alive. The other 2/3 were dead. So they transferred them. Again, this is the evil of the Nazis. They transferred them to Melk, which was a subcamp of Mauthausen. And Melk was strictly designed to work people to death. It was strictly designed as a place where you were guaranteed to work yourself into exhaustion and ultimately into death. Because the whole purpose was to carry rocks from one place to another place. And then carry them back. So there was no rhyme or reason. But they were not going to allow these Jews to live. Again, he was lucky and was transferred to the final camp, Ebensee. And I visited all these places. When he got to Ebensee, it's one of the most beautiful areas in Austria, the Salzkammergut, which is an area that has all the salt mines and mountains. And the place where the lager was surrounded by huge mountains. And he told me, he said, I looked around and I thought, even God can't see us in here. Nobody can help us. So that's where he was liberated. It was another place of evil. I want you to know that every place that the Germans had crematorium, and in addition to that, most of them had the ability to gas people to death, no matter how small they were. So it was industrialized commercial murder. They were liberated by the Americans. The Americans were wonderful. The Americans gave them an abundance of food. They showed them kindness that they had not seen in 6 years. They tended to them. Many of them died after liberation from the inability to eat again. When you subsist on a diet of rotten turnip soup and bread made mostly out of sawdust, it's hard for your system to start to eat normal food again. So a lot of them died after that. But my dad was always a man who was resilient and always optimistic. And within a month, he was back up to a little over 100 pounds. So he really did well. But the main thing is that his integrity and courage were recognized because the Americans needed a liaison between the Army and the inmates. So he was chosen by his fellows to be the representative to control food distribution, clothing, and medicine. And not only for that camp, but also for the entire Salzkammergut. So he traveled around. He didn't know how to drive, so they had to draft somebody to drive him around. So he had a driver. But he came to a small camp, a women's camp in Lansing, and that's where my mother was. And he was a big man, you know. I mean, he had a chauffeur. He had all the food he wanted. Everything was had a position of real importance. And he saw her and fell dead in love with her and said, "Would you like to go for a ride with me?" She said, "Get lost." You know, I mean, she wasn't interested in a romantic relationship at that point. So he wasn't going to give up. He actually made several unnecessary trips to Lansing under the pretense of doing business to see her. And she finally gave in. They finally became in love, and they actually married 2 weeks later. They went to Italy to a DP camp that was designed to teach them how to farm and to soldier. They were going to go to Israel, which was my father's dream. Didn't happen because my mother got pregnant with me. And the only way into Israel was illegally through Ali Abed, through ships that were actually beached. And then you had to swim ashore and fight your way into the promised land. So it wasn't going to work for a pregnant woman or for a woman with a small child. So his dream of going to Israel was dashed. So we had to transfer to a camp in northern Italy, in Torino, and that's where I was born. I'll tell you just a little bit about that. I didn't know what normal life was supposed to be like. We lived in one room with one window, one bed, and a hot plate. We shared a toilet with 8 other families, as well as a cooking facility for 8 other families. My parents thought it was Taj Mahal, you know, compared to what they had lived in and what they had experienced. The Americans gave us good, nutritious food. It wasn't the best, but it was good. My dad managed to get work. We weren't supposed to work as displaced people, but he managed to get a job working in Sherwood there. And as a result, we fared better than most people. While we were there, I noticed that, and only by retrospect, because there were no teenagers, there were no kids some of your ages, there were no older people, there were no grandparents. I didn't even understand the concept of grandparents until I came to the United States, because they'd all been killed. You know, the people that they felt were not worthy of living or couldn't contribute were killed. So that's where I spent the first 3.5 years of my life. That's where I started. That's where I learned values and the importance of being a good human being from my parents and from all the other survivors. They were the only family we had. Ultimately, out of the over 200 members of my father's family, he and 2 brothers and 1 cousin survived. And my grandmother was sent to the Warsaw Ghetto, and there she and my aunt, Lila Mendel, and her baby were sent to the Umschlagplatz, which was the German for departure point. And Germans like to play this game with the Jewish women. They would snatch a baby out of a mother's hand by the feet, and they would take that baby and smash its skull against the wall of the ground. And their rationale was, well, the baby's going to cry on the train ride to Treblinka, and so everybody will be upset and fretting because of the crying of the baby. So we'll just kill him here. So they tried to grab my aunt's baby, and she clung to it for dear life. So he saw that he wasn't going to be able to take the baby from her, so he just ran his bayonet through the baby and my aunt. That was the last thing my grandmother saw before she got on the train for Tripoli Cook. Now, I know this because our cousin who survived was actually part of the Jewish militia, which was in the Holocaust, and saw this happen. I don't know for sure. My grandmother either was gassed or died of grief on the way there. But these things that I've told you are not intended to upset you. I want you to know what can happen when good people do nothing. I want you to know that you can't hate somebody enough to do these kind of things, to allow them to happen. You have to stand up and be counted. I haven't shown you pictures of gore and horrible things because honestly, I don't need to. I think you understand what I've been talking about. And again, I can't thank you enough for being here. To me, it's an opportunity to do what I'm supposed to do, which is to make sure that history is not revised or denied, and that you all know where you came from and where you're going. God bless you all. I really hope you have a wonderful life and a wonderful career in whatever you do. And I appreciate you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bromberg. You guys give him another hand for sharing. I think we have time for a couple questions, just maybe one or two, but we would love for anybody to ask a question that you might have. Shauna has here's one right here. Shauna's got a mic, and then I've got another one here, so.
I have a question. Do you have any siblings, and if so, are they still alive?
I have one sister who's a doctor, and she's very much alive. She has actually, she's a renowned doctor in her profession. She was on the staff at Barnes Hospital in St. Louis, and she has 3 children, and I have 4. And all of our children are very successful and have really done well, have families. And I might mention, my parents were married 2 weeks after they were liberated, but they were married for 58 years until my father passed away. They are exactly like most survivors who married within a month of the liberation. And I don't know of one of them that got a divorce, because they were the only people that could understand what the other one had gone through.
So early on, you mentioned the Jews tax. What exactly was that?
Jews tax was a tax that was levied on the Jews for being allowed to be in the area they were in. In other words, it was a repressive tax that was levied on them to further differentiate them from the regular population. You got to remember, when Jews first came to Europe, they were strange. I mean, you know, they dressed differently. Everything they did was contrary to what the Europeans knew. They had these laws of kashrut, which were dietary laws that really are nothing but proper health and nutrition. They used to eat off of wooden bowls. So if you ate dairy products out of a wooden bowl, and then ate meat, every chance you were going to get a dysentery or you know, a disease. I mean, they really, they didn't eat animals that didn't have a cleft hoof. You know, of course, back then, pigs had trichinosis. I mean, today you don't have to worry about that. But then, it was a terrible thing, you know. And the cleft hoof animals, like cattle or sheep, were cleaner. So, anyway, that's what Jews tax was. One more question. Somebody give me a really good
Okay.
one.
I would like to know where your family originated from.
Well, they originated in Israel, but around the time, shortly after Christ was born, the Romans had had enough of the Hebrews, because the Hebrews were fierce warriors, and they had actually tottered the Roman Empire, not once but twice. I mean, they really were causing a lot of aggravation and grief. I actually visited the Dead Sea and that area, and there were 10 Roman legions there to subdue the Maccabees. 10 Roman legions. I mean, that was something else. So they said, you know what? We get rid of these guys. And they sent them to the four corners of the earth. That's where you got the wandering Jew from, because they were wanderers. I mean, they were strangers in every land. And when you do that, when a man can't wake up in his own land, open his eyes and see his land, he becomes an inferior being. And that's what happened to the Jews. They were separated, they were made into scapegoats, and basically they lost their will. I thank you all so much. I think you're wonderful. I think the staff here is wonderful for doing this. And if you want to come out to Montana State University, that's where I'll be speaking next. So I appreciate you very much. Have a great day.